Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi everyone, Tracy here. Welcome to this episode of Folkloring. Before we head into today's topic of sacred water, I wanted to let you know about some changes here at Folkloring. As previous listeners know, Tanya is off living the homesteading life, and that's a lot of work. She's decided that she wants to simplify her life a bit, so she'll be stepping back from the podcast. She will be back as a guest co-host as her schedule allows, and believe me, I will be bugging her about it. Going forward, there'll be a mix of me doing solo episodes in the format that you're used to, without, of course, all the witty banter, and episodes with guests. The guest episodes will be either interviews or guest co-hosts. Along with this, I am very excited to announce that Folkloring is moving under the umbrella of the Folklore Podcast, which is created and hosted by Mark Norman. Our new, very long title will be Folkloring, a folklore podcast production. But you can just call us Folkloring. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out on Facebook or Instagram or email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com. So, to kick off the first episode in the new format, I want to tell you how I've been folkloring recently. And it is all about the gardening. So much gardening going on. I've been harvesting herbs like mad, which is great. And my cucumbers, tomatoes, eggplants are all starting to come in. And it's killing me to try and wait to let them actually mature and ripen because I want them all right away. And they're so adorable when they're little. So that has been taking up all of my time, had very little time for anything else. And with that, I want to dive right into our sacred water topic. Now, I'm going to start with sacred springs and holy wells. And a spring is when water emerges from the ground, right, and comes out. It's at surface level on the earth. And at sites where people have placed stone troughs or basins around these springs, those are known as wells, as opposed to the kind of wells that people dig for water. A lot of these wells and springs are purported to have therapeutic properties. And actually, it's pretty interesting because there was testing in Victorian times when there was a craze about going to these wells for their healing powers. And it shows that there are certain minerals that really can have a positive effect on the human body. So there is some science behind it. But also folklore tells us about a lot of these different places and what they're good for and what people have historically gone to some of these wells to act for the actual health benefits. Now, I'm definitely not going to get into a detailed list. I'll give you a couple of examples of some different specific kinds of healing in different locations, but I found 1,089 examples of sacred springs and healing wells in the United Kingdom alone. And so there's tons of them, and there's thousands if you include, the entire British Isles. Now, in addition to healing, a lot of these sacred springs and holy wells were used for divination in some cases. They were used for good luck charms. And a modern example that I think pretty much everyone will be familiar with are wishing wells. Now, all major civilizations developed initially around a source of water, and mostly fresh, so that it could be used for drinking, other essential day-to-day activities like agriculture, and large bodies of water were also key for successful trade and defense. And so clean water that emanated from springs or streams was vital to local communities. And so structures would often be built up around this source of clean water to protect it from contaminants. And so that's where we get those early wells. And a lot of ancient cultures and religions ascribed magical qualities to clean water. There was often a belief that all earthly things, including and sometimes expressly human beings, were unclean. And water would be the thing that could counter that inherent uncleanliness. And purification was thought to be achieved by means of ritual cleansing in many cases. Now, the idea that offering money to water would give you a return dates back to Roman, British, and Celtic mythology. And there is a story of Mimir, who was an Assyrian god, but also believed to be a water spirit. And according to Norse tradition, Mimir resided by and guarded the well of wisdom. And he drank from the well daily and was recorded to be the wisest of all world beings. And the Norse god Odin was in need of wisdom to save the world from destruction. So he sought to drink from this well, but Mimir's fee for drinking from the well was very steep. He sought the seeker's right eye. And hesitantly, Odin did make this sacrifice and received the drink. And then it was said that his eye was then tossed into the well so that others would see that a price must be paid for the benefits of water. There was also a belief that waters had mystical powers, and that springs and wells were guarded by spirits said to reside at the source of the water. And speaking something out loud over the source could make it come to pass if the spirits were thus inclined. And so it became common practice to beseech a blessing of a well's divinity or spirit and to offer something in return. And they would offer coins or valuables. So that became common because you're asking something of the gods. Now, obviously, wishing wells are still very popular today, and you can find them in town squares and various different places. I'm just going to touch on a couple of famous ancient wishing wells. And the first is Coventina's Well in Northumberland. And that was a well that was honoring the Celtic goddess Coventina. And she was a nymph goddess and associated with childbirth and healing. And her well is in the center of a small temple. And in this well, there were over 16,000 coins discovered, and including coins that were issued between the 1st and the 5th centuries, so went on for a really long time. And interestingly, most of the coins that they found there were of low denomination bronze coins, indicating that the value of the coin was in itself not all that important in making the wish. It was just making the offering that was important. Now, another one called the Well of Penrhys in Oxford was a popular wishing well into the late 1800s. And was visited by people who believed that the waters of the well had healing powers. And so they were hoping to heal a wound or disease. And in doing that, it was customary to tie a piece of clothing onto a branch of a nearby tree and also throw a pin, button, or coin into the well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about pins in a minute. And so at this well, the pieces of clothing were believed to be a quote, vehicle of the disease, so that a person could be cured while the article was thrown into the well as the more special means of establishing a beneficial relationship with whatever divinity was in the well. Now, the fact that the tokens could be buttons or pins kind of reinforces that idea that the value of what you were putting into the well didn't matter as much as that you were just making that offering. Now, as opposed to the last well, the people visiting this well were not acknowledging a specific deity, but sort of a vague notion of a more supernatural power. Now, for an example that is still in use today, the Trevi Fountain in Rome was at the junction of 3 roads. And in the 15th century, a fountain was commissioned for the ending of the Roman aqueduct, and the fountain was created. And the fountain's current look was finished in 1729 by Giuseppe Panini, and the Trevi Foundation currently receives over €30,000 per day, and the proceeds assist with funding a market for Rome's poor. Now, I spoke a couple minutes ago about putting pins in wells instead of coins, and there is actually such a thing as pin wells, where it was common to not use coins but use pins. And pins were commonly used because they were smaller and cheaper, and they did have value because they were useful, but people typically also had them. So some various reasons why different wells were used as pin wells. In Wales, it was thought that evil spirits were warded off by throwing pins in these pin wells. And there is a well in Cornwall called Piran's Well, and it was a custom there to drop 1 or 2 pins into the well when a child was baptized. At Bede's Well in Durham, ill children were brought to the well and a crooked pin was put in. Now, in some wells, certain days were associated with going and giving the pins. At Wooler, Northumberland, the pin well there was visited by a procession of people from the village on every May Day, and each would drop a crooked pin into it and make a wish. And the wishing well of St. Roche in Cornwall was visited on Holy Thursday or Ascension Day. Now, pin wells were also associated with the fairies, and at the Piskey Well in Cornwall, people threw pins to get the goodwill of the pixies. And near to this holy well, there are 2 cavities in the mountain's limestone rock called the Fairy Church and the Fairy Chapel. And about 300 yards to the north, there used to be another well called the Pin Well, into which it was thought indispensable that anyone who sought healing by drinking the waters of the holy well should, on passing the pin well, drop a pin. Now, in many places, girls would cast pins into wells for love predictions. And in Yorkshire, there was a reason given for this. A local woman has said to have been enchanted by the fairies looking into a well, and they appeared to explain to her their need for pins. Apparently, they were using hawthorn thorns for their arrows, and these were not very effective. But some of the fairy folk had noticed that the pins used by local women would be an ideal replacement. However, the fairies had no real way of obtaining these pins, and so they arranged that any woman who visited the well and dropped a pin would find out about the identity of their true love reflected in the water. After awakening from her enchantment, she threw a pin in, and she saw the face of her sweetheart, and so spread the news, and the fairies got their arrows. Sadly, the well is now lost, so you will not be able to do that for yourself. Now I want to take a little bit closer look at healing waters. And in Holyhead, North Wales, at St. Sibie's Church, and St. Sibie is reputed to have come to Wales sometime around the middle of the 6th century AD, and was born the son of the King of Cornwall. Now, he traveled widely through South Wales and Ireland, establishing churches as he went, before he came with his disciples to Northwest Wales toward the end of his life. And he established a church at Holyhead around 540 AD within the walls of a ruined Roman fort. And the well was supposedly created when he struck a rock with his staff, which allowed the rock to break and the water to gush forth. And so the well became a place of pilgrimage, and the waters were reputed to cure warts, lameness, blindness, scrofula, scurvy, rheumatism. And the well continued in use until after the Reformation through as late as the 18th century. And treatments consisted of giving patients an equal quantity of well water and seawater morning and evening for a period varying from 7 to 10 days. And then they had to bathe in the water once a day or maybe twice a day, and retiring after the bath to a bedchamber in the adjoining cottage where they were given a quantity of the healing water to drink. And the success or otherwise of the treatment was judged by whether the patient became warm in bed or stayed cold in the bed. If they stayed warm, that indicated that the treatment was progressing and they were going to get better. And the patients would throw pennies and pieces of silver into the water after each immersion, and they would often take bottles of this water away with them. Now, interestingly, there is another story about this same well, was that if a local girl wished to know her lover's intentions, she would spread her handkerchief on the water of the well. And if the water pushed the handkerchief to the south, the man was honest and honorable. But if the water shifted the handkerchief northward, the opposite was true. So I guess you have a one-stop shop there where you can find true love and get healed. So another type of healing water comes from what is called the Clutie well. And people have visited Clutie wells to cure sickness since at least 620 AD, when the original Clutie well was associated with St. Boniface. And today, hundreds of offerings of cloth or clute can be seen hanging from the trees that surround these water sources. And traditionally, those seeking healing would circle the well sunwise 3 times before splashing some of its water onto the ground and making a prayer. And then a piece of cloth or clute that had been in contact with the ill person would then be tied to a nearby tree. And as the cloth disintegrated, the sick person would heal, and anyone removing a rag would succumb to the misfortunes of the original owner, according to tradition. And at these Clutie wells, sick children would also be left here overnight to be healed. So very similar to the well at Penrhys that we talked about earlier. Just to give you an idea of what some of these wells were believed to have cured, I'm going to give you a couple examples. There's St. Mary's Well in Orton Moray in Scotland, and this has a long history of pilgrimage, and the cures were for the sickness of the eyes and the joints, as well as whooping cough. And then there's St. Wallach's Well and Baths in Aberdeenshire, and this was again for eye disease, but it was also a pin well, so people would leave pins there. And it's said that it is specifically for children, or not specifically, particularly for children. And hundreds of children are said to have been dipped there every year. Then we have the Melshach Well, and that's again in Aberdeenshire. And the waters here were said to restore fertility in barren women or cure a sick animal, and harnesses were often left at the site as an offering. Then we have the Loch Shienta in Skye, and there the sick would circle the spring 3 times in a clockwise direction after drinking the water. And then offerings would be made of clothing, colored threads, pins, coins, and people who went there sought cures for stones and depression. And I like this one a lot because there is a sacred trout which swims in the loch where the spring drains and is said to be a guardian of the well. And traditionally, people will not fish there. And also, wood would neither be cut from the trees surrounding the spring, because that's where people believed the spirits lived, and they didn't want the bad luck. And now hazel trees surround the spring. Now, before I move on from springs entirely, I wanted to quickly touch on something called a ballan. And at many Irish holy wells, you can find stones, large stones with depressions within them, which are often filled with water. And these depressions will also often have round stones within them. And they might have been primitive baptismal fonts. And in some cases, the water collected in these depressions was rain, and it was said that they could cure warts. Although there is one well, St. Kiernan's well, that has one that is specifically for headaches. And the origin of this is debatable, but one theory says that they began as a place to grind herbs in order to support the healing water. So whatever herbs that they were going to use for complementary healing would be ground up there. Okay, moving on from wells and springs, I want to take a look at holy water. And holy water traditionally comes from the church and is blessed by the priest. And you would use it to bless religious items, bless your home, your workplace, your pets, to drive away evil, to inspire us to ask forgiveness, and in certain cases, cure for ailments, as we talked earlier about taking the water with you. Now, there are various kinds of holy water, which I was not aware of previously. The principal one, which is used in, sprinkling in the wall fonts of churches and in homes, and generally what people think of as holy water. Then, of course, there's baptismal water, which contains oil of catechumens and chrism oil, and is only used in baptism. And then there's consecration water, sometimes referred to as Gregorian water, and that has ashes, salt, and wine, and is used in the consecration of churches. Now, I found it very interesting that there is a couple of different ways to make holy water, and there is a recipe in the Old Testament, and the recipe reads, "The priest shall take holy water in an earthen vessel, and some of the dust that is on the floor of the tabernacle, and put it in the water." And later in the Old Testament, we find instructions pertaining to one who has been defiled by touching a corpse. "He who touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and so be clean." So that's the old school way, right, to do that. Now, another interesting fact is that you can, in fact, make your own holy water at home. And it's thought that this holy water is not as powerful as the holy water that the clergy would make, but it's still useful and you can use it in a pinch. And so first, before you make the holy water, you have to create an consecrated salt, basically. So you'll get your salt and make it sacred by reciting what is known as the Roman ritual. So over the salt, you say, "Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. O salt, creature of God, I exorcise you by the living God, by the true God, by the holy God, by the God who ordered you to be poured into the water, by Eliseo the prophet, so that its life-giving powers might be restored. I exorcise you so that you may become a means of salvation for believers, that you may bring health of soul and body to all who make use of you, and that you may put to flight and drive away from the places where you are sprinkled every apparition, villainy, and turn of devilish deceit, and every unclean spirit, adjured by him who will come to judge the living and the dead, and the world by fire. Amen." So you say that over the salt. Now, if you're consecrating the salt in front of witnesses, you can invite them to join you in a further prayer. I'm not going to go through all of that because it's just as long as the first one, but you can find it online by looking for the Roman ritual. And So then you basically take the salt, put it in a container, and there's no special requirement for the container that you have to use. And then you obtain some water, and it's better if it can be from a natural source, but it doesn't have to be if you can't get that. Or you could use like store-bought distilled water or spring water. That's a good choice too. And then you exercise the water. So before you combine the salt and the water, you'll need to recite, again, there's another passage from the Roman ritual that you'll need to recite. And then a second one, if you're doing it in front of witnesses. And then you combine the salt and water, and you have your own homemade holy water. So how's that for a little bit of folkloring for you? Of course, if you are not Catholic, there are different ways to make other kinds of holy water. A lot of people make sun water or moon water. And the idea behind that is that water is receptive. It's not an impenetrable solid, so it can absorb the energies of the sun or the moon. You can also burn herbs. You can submerge water-safe crystals in your water. You can sit with your water and infuse it with your intention. I don't myself usually do any kind of sun water, moon water, storm water, mostly because I'm lazy that way. I do love some good sun tea. So I guess that is technically putting some herbs into water and letting it infuse and get all of the power of the sun. And then I get to consume it. So I guess technically I do make sun water. So right there is some easy folkloring that you can do. Now I want to move on and talk about something called holy bogs. And bogs begin life basically as shallow lakes and ponds. And they owe their special properties to sphagnum, which is a particular breed of moss that grows in these shallow lakes and ponds. And the sphagnum soaks up the water that forms the ponds and releases a compound that then binds nitrogen and calcium to it, creating a very acidic anaerobic environment that inhibits bacterial activity. And so in this oxygen deficient atmosphere, it prevents organic material from entirely decaying, right? Because it's not having that aerobic effect on it. And so this means that dead plant material in the ponds never fully decompose. Instead, they build up into compressed layers. And as time goes on, the ponds disappear, transformed by the combined effect of the sphagnum absorbing the water and the buildup of organic materials that doesn't break down. The peat bogs then remain. And so it's forced from these layers. And once it's formed, the unique environment of peat bogs continues to preserve other organic materials as well. And it, essentially slows the rate of decomposition. And at the same time, the acid of the moss tans anything that falls into them with sort of a reddish tinge. And so these environmental conditions preserve organic material. And so wood, hide, even certain foods have been found perfectly preserved by peat. And the other thing that we find preserved is human flesh. Now, the one thing, interestingly, that peat bogs cannot preserve is bone. And this is because the tannins in the peat speed up bone decay. And so if there are bodies that are put into peat bogs, they sort of warp into a kind of sack-like appearance. So in the bog, bacteria and other microorganisms aren't able to break down organic tissue, and it can suspend biological remains for thousands of years. Now, there are quite a few bodies that have been found in bogs, and archaeologists suspect that there is something unusual about many of the bog bodies beyond this extraordinary preservation. Couple of things. To be buried at all during the period of history where we find many of these bodies come from, being buried was not the norm. Formal burials were rare in Iron Age Europe, and the dead were often cremated, given sky burials, or a range of other practices in order to take care of the bodies. Many of the bodies that are found in bogs were, from this time period, were young adults, adolescents, and children who seemed to mostly be fit and healthy. Now, some were found naked, except for maybe a well-preserved piece of rope, a hat, or a cloak, and sometimes there was clothing buried separately from them, but nearby. And above all, many of these bodies suffered extremely violent deaths. And so, in order to understand what these bog bodies might have come from, you have to understand what the bog environment meant in Iron Age and Roman era Europe. And I have a quote from Melanie Giles, who's the senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Manchester and author of the book Bog Bodies, Face to Face with the Past. She says, "We see the bogs as empty places. That's not how Iron Age people saw them. They were taking fuel from the bog, cutting turf, taking iron ore. They were making tools and weapons like cauldrons and swords. They were taking sphagnum moss and weaving extraordinary things with it. They were hunting the bird life that lived there. The bogs were rich and productive places for Iron Age people." And so we don't see them the same. We see them as more empty spaces that is not usable. We can't grow things there, that sort of thing. And the bog is also a very liminal space. And it's somewhere between land and water. It's not really either. And it's, they have vapors coming off of them. Sometimes those vapors spontaneously combust. They were perceived as possibly being gateways to other worlds, gateways to the gods. So here, it would have been logical that people would make sacrifices to the gods by sinking gifts into the water. And these gifts might be slaughtered domestic animals, clothes, shoes, jewelry, tools, pottery vessels filled with food. And these kinds of offerings might be intended to secure, for example, a good and plentiful harvest. And when we look at the bodies that are there and the ways in which people died, it's really easy to come to a conclusion that they were sacrificed and or killed by some sort of nefarious means. Now, I want to give you just a couple of the more famous examples of different bodies found in bogs and what we can learn from these people that we believe were sacrificed. The first one is from Cheshire, England, and he's called the Lindau Man. Now, it was only the top half of his body that was found, and it was a male body. And what they have determined about him was that when he got to the bog, he was still alive. Because it would have been very difficult maneuvering a dead or a stunned person to such a location. Because bogs are dangerous. There are places where if you make a misstep, you're going to go down below the surface and drown. And it was very treacherous. And the details of his fatal injuries also points toward the fact that he was alive. The whoever actually killed him was very knowledgeable about human anatomy. And so it appears that they kept this person hovering on the edges between life and death for some time. And then when he was pushed down into the bog, he was still breathing because they found water in the lungs. Now, there are further clues that come from his stomach. His final meal was a very plain meal. It was barley-based and possibly somewhat charred. It was like a griddle cake, essentially. And amongst the priestly classes of Britain in this particular era, a griddle cake would have been used in a ceremony. And it was a ceremony that was sort of like pulling the short straw. And the people would pull pieces of griddle cake from a bag, and the person whose piece was most charred and burned was the person who would be the scapegoat. And it also, his stomach contained the telltale trace of another plant, which is mistletoe. And it was believed then that mistletoe was a medicinal plant used for nervous disorders. And it might have been given to Lindoman to calm him down and render him a little more pliable. So certainly horrible. But then there is another one called the Graubaul man. And this was an Iron Age farmer who lived in around 390 BC in Denmark. Now, his final meal involved more than 60 different types of plants, and they were all mashed together, and it appears that it was kind of a porridge of cereals, and it would have been really bitter tasting, and it had weeds and grasses and lots of seeds and plants from a wide area that had been gathered for this meal, which suggests that the people there had a mastery over this territory. And it also suggests that the meal was ritualized and was represented as part of the sacrifice. And it's speculated that it might have been a humiliating meal because it would have been so unpalatable. Now, he also had a psychoactive substance added to this meal, but in this case, it would have been the opposite of calming. They found traces of alkaloid toxins in his gut, and it revealed that his last meal included ergot, which is a fungus that grows on ears of cereal such as rye and barley. And in large doses, ergot poisoning causes hallucination and horrible side effects known as St. Anthony's fire, which involves circulatory failure, a burning sensation, loss of extremities, but at the levels found in Graubaulman's stomach, it would have had a much milder effect that would have made him act oddly. He would have had weaving motions, he would have gotten very hot, and he would have sort of had a psychosis that might have made him cry out or shriek. And those behaviors may too have been part of the sacrifice. So really horrific stuff. The last one I want to share with you is the Tolland man. And he was found in a bog in Denmark in 1950. And he is currently at the Silkeborg Museum. And he is in a fetal position. And the acids in the bog turned him more of like a bluish color. But his stubble and his hair were bright orange. He wears a sheepskin cap, though, that covers most of it, and it's very detailed in the preservation. Now, aside from this cap, Tolland man was buried wearing only a woven belt around his middle and a noose around his neck. If he had any other kind of garment on, it would have been preserved, especially it likely would have been woolen, and that the bog acids preserve collagen and keratin, which are present in materials like wool and his hair. So there was no real imprint of any cloth on the surface of his skin either. And so all in all, the conditions of how they found him really points to a ritualistic death. He was shaved, he was put in the bog, and leaving this noose with the bog is conspicuous, as even something as simple as a woven piece of rope had value and could be reused again. So they wouldn't have just put it in there for, no good reason. Now, he could have been an offering to the gods because, people were, again, taking fuel and turf and iron ore, and it might have been as a repayment for those gifts that the bog was giving, that the spirits of the bog were giving. Now, although these are horrific, it's certainly not to say that all of the bodies that have been found in bogs are sacrifices. As I said earlier, it's dangerous territory, right? People might drown with a misstep, they might lose their footing, they might die of exposure out there. It could just have been a handy place if someone had committed a murder. And some people, if they had committed suicide, back in those days, these kinds of deaths were treated with fear. So someone who died mysteriously or unnaturally, like a suicide, would not be considered, they wouldn't want to bury them in any kind of hallowed ground. And so they would put them in the bog to take care of that problem. So, really horrifying stuff. But I don't want to end on a down note. So I do want to take a quick look at water offerings before I go. And so not only is it making an offering to the water, but you can make an offering of water. And there's a couple of specific ways that you can do that. The first is libation. And in ancient times, libation was a common form of sacrificial offering. This involves pouring out a liquid, which was often wine or water, on the ground as an offering to the gods. And in the Bible, libation signifies submission and obedience to God. For example, during the Feast of the Tabernacles, it's a time of great rejoicing, and Jewish people would pour out water and wine as offerings in memory of God's provision of water during their journey through the wilderness. And this act was symbolic of the hope and faith that God would provide for their needs. And it symbolizes purity, cleansing, refreshment, and is believed to be a representation of God's Spirit. Now, in Christianity, worship water is often used to represent the Holy Spirit or the cleansing of sins. And drink offerings are sort of a shared experience in a spiritual context, much like receiving communion. Now, in addition to pouring out water or sharing drink offerings, there is a practice in Tibetan Buddhism, and it is a traditional water offering that goes on an altar. And it is said there that water offerings are to have more powerful benefits than other material offerings, including gold and silver. And that's because water is unlike any other offering substance, because rich and poor alike can relinquish water more easily than other offerings, and it can be offered without regret, untainted by any stinginess or need, and can be offered for the sake of merit and virtue. And so in this practice, it's traditional to offer 7 individual bowls of water. And the water is pure water, but it does represent 7 different things. So the first bowl would be drinking water, and that's, pure clean water. It symbolizes auspicious results of all virtuous causes. In the second bowl is washing water, and that water might be just pure water. It also might be scented with sandalwood or saffron, and it symbols purification. The third bowl symbolizes flowers, and it represents all flowers on earth, symbolizes the beauty and flowering of enlightenment and the opening of one's heart through enlightenment. The fourth bowl is the incense bowl, and that is to represent making an offering of a beautiful scent to the Buddha and symbolizes morality, ethics, and discipline. And then the fifth is lamps or light, and it symbolizes dispelling of all darkness of the mind, so basically ignorance. And there's sometimes a butter lamp that goes with this particular bowl. The sixth is perfumed water, and that symbolizes perseverance and joyful effort that is at the heart of enlightenment. And the seventh is food, and that symbolizes the clear and stable mind, or like meditative absorption. And so there's a specific process for how you pour out the water, how you line up the bowls, how close they are to each other, where the lamp goes. All of that is easily searchable online, because I easily searched it. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, that's a really, really beautiful practice. And so that happens every morning, or as often as you can, if you can't do it every day. So you put it up in the morning, and then you reverse the process in the evening and pour the water out of the bowls and store them in a particular way. And so it's just a daily practice that people do to remind themselves of this symbolism. And of course, reminding ourselves of symbolism is really at the heart of folkloring. And so I am going to go through a few ideas that you can do easily at home and honor sacred water. So we went over some of these things as I was talking, but you can certainly make sun water, moon water, storm water. I know a lot of people made eclipse water with the eclipse we had not too long ago. And those are easy things to do. You know, you get your water if you want to get it from a natural source. That's fine. But if you intend on drinking it, of course, make sure that it is safe to drink. And you infuse it with your intention. You put it out under the sun, the moon, in a storm. Maybe you want to gather some rainwater, or put it out under the eclipse. You can do something as simple as tossing a coin in a wishing well. We run across those all the time. You can, as I said earlier, make your own holy water, or you can buy holy water. And I think when we were talking about folk Catholicism, I did discover that you can, in fact, buy your holy water from Amazon if you choose to do that. And you can also buy it from, your local parish. You can make an offering of water. You can use it in a ritual if you're so inclined to do rituals. A lot of people use water if they're trying to symbolize the elements in a ritual. So earth, air, fire, and water. And so they might use that just as part of the altar that they create for a ritual, or they might pour it out, as we talked about earlier. Yeah, you might make that offering, or you might make an offering on your home altar with a little dish of water. And again, it comes back to what is your intention. You can scry in water and relax yourself, calm yourself. And as you gaze into a bowl of water, it's, another form of divination. We talked about divination earlier. But, you sort of relax yourself, and as you gaze into the water, you see what comes up for you, what images arise for you. You can go to natural bodies of water. I am very fortunate to be very close to Lake Michigan, and I always feel so much peace when I just go down to the beach, especially early in the morning. Also, another really easy thing is that when you're bathing or showering, if you do so mindfully and you think about what that means, you think about washing yourself clean. You think about the water running over you and taking away negative energy or negative thoughts or whatever it is. And that's something that you don't have to take any extra time out of your day to do unless it makes you hang out in the shower for much longer. And I'm sure that other people have some great ideas of what they can do with water. And if you want to let me know you have any thoughts or comments, I would love to hear it. And thanks for spending the time to listen today. Happy folkloring. As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.